Hello, welcome back to our second WIMBA session for Anatomy and Physiology 2. This is Professor Young, and we'll be reviewing what we talked about this last lecture section, which is a little bit more on the autonomic nervous system. And of course, you remember we started off the class with this slide and just kind of reviewing what we've already discussed about the two branches of the autonomic nervous system, which you should recognize as being the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system, and what some of those differences are between them. Of course, the parasympathetic nervous system is in charge of digestion, activation of the gastrointestinal tract, the GI tract, slower heart rate, slower respiratory rate, therefore would be lower blood pressure, divergence of blood flow from skeletal muscle into the smooth muscle, basically the relaxation, calming down, and energy conservation and restoration. Whereas the sympathetic nervous system is going to be just the opposite. It's going to divert that blood flow from the GI tract and put it back into the skeletal tissue. It's going to increase blood pressure. It's going to increase cardiac output. It's going to increase the respiratory rate as well. So they do work, even though they are opposites, they do work in tandem with one another. Remember that term autonomic tone, where when sympathetic nervous system is working, parasympathetic is also working. They work together in opposite directions to achieve the desired outcome, whether it's ramping up the body or calming the body down. This here was simply a review of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, specifically as far as which each of those control. Please remember that the parasympathetic nervous system gives rise from pretty much the brainstem and the sacral region, whereas the sympathetic nervous system is primarily going to give rise from the spinal areas. And you can see that there. Take a few minutes. You can review that, study that. If you need to pause this presentation to kind of look over that and just make sure you understand what each of those divisions of the autonomic nervous system regulates and oversees. So again, if you need to pause the presentation now, you can go ahead and do that and kind of look at that and make notes and discuss that. I guess you would discuss that with yourself, unless you have other people around. The enteric nervous system, this is a specialized nervous branch of the nervous system that falls under the autonomic nervous system, simply because sympathetic and parasympathetic does play a regulatory role within the enteric nervous system. When I say regulatory role, understand that it is not the chief regulator. The enteric nervous system or the enteric nervous system it really has a mind of its own, and it has its own regulatory control, but it works with the autonomic nervous system to basically correspond with the brain. We're going to discuss this in a lot more detail once we get into the digestive system. But just know and understand as far as right now that the enteric nervous system acts as a control mechanism for the gastrointestinal tract. It oversees intestinal contraction or peristalsis, as we will come to learn that is what it's called, throughout the intestinal tract to help to move chyme, C-H-Y-M-E, from the stomach into the intestine to help to lead to reabsorption of minerals and nutrients into the small intestines and fecal composition within the large intestines or the colon. And so all of that from stomach peristalsis to intestinal peristalsis to reabsorption and absorption to eventually the formation of feces is all kind of overseen and regulated by this enteric or enteric system. All right, this is really what I want to get into with you to make sure that you understand this, because this is the bread and butter, if you would, of the autonomic nervous system. We understand from AMP1 that a message within the nervous system is going to be sent along neurons. But what differs here is somatic messages versus autonomic messages. And please make sure that you understand here that when we say somatic, we are really referring to the body. Right? That is what somatic here means. Whereas autonomic is going to be specialized within the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So a message that is sent through the somatic nervous system would be a message that would be delivered directly from the central nervous system to muscular tissue. This is what you learned about last semester with AMP1. What we're concerned about now is what is exactly the structure of neural reflex that occurs within the autonomic, within the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. And what you need to understand is that there's really three sections to this response or this reflex within the autonomic nervous system. First, we have the preganglion nerve or neuron. And the job of the preganglion neuron is to connect, if you would, the central nervous system with the autonomic ganglion, which is located outside of the central nervous system. It will go ahead and release a neurotransmitter that was delivered from the central nervous system, travels down the preganglion, and ends up in this autonomic ganglion. From there, a neurotransmitter will be released from the autonomic ganglion based on the message received from the preganglion neuron, and it will be sent down the postganglion neuron. It is the job of the postganglion neuron, or nerve, to stimulate a reaction within that target tissue. Now, the length and location of your preganglion nerve, your autonomic ganglion, and your postganglion nerve is going to differ between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. Remember, parasympathetic has a very long preganglion, and the autonomic ganglion is located real close to the target tissue, which means it has a short postganglion. Just the opposite is seen within the sympathetic nervous system. You tend to have a shorter preganglion. The autonomic ganglion is located further away from the target tissue, and then you have a longer postganglion. And so what does this look like? Well, it looks very similar to this. Again, the bottom one that we're looking at down here, this here would be a somatic reflex as opposed to the top reflex here, which would be an autonomic reflex. You see, this here would become the preganglion. That there would be the preganglion. This here would be the that there would be the autonomic ganglion, which would be this right here. You can see inside of here. You can see inside of here very clearly that you've got the area where the preganglion and the autonomic ganglion meet, so that neurotransmitter would go across that synaptic cleft into the autonomic ganglion, and from there a message will be sent down along the postganglion. And again, that would be a nerve, and that would lead to whatever the target tissue here would be. In most cases, that is going to be some type of smooth muscle or cardiac muscle or a gland. All right, so that's the difference. The somatic system is much more simplified than what the autonomic response system is. So we've got central nervous system, preganglion. Preganglion releases neurotransmitter into the autonomic ganglion. The autonomic ganglion is then going to release the neurotransmitter and allow that message to be sent down the postganglion neuron until it reaches its target tissue, in which more neurotransmitter will be released into the effector area. We will spend some time discussing the adrenal glands a little bit more as we enter into Chapter 17, which is on the endocrine system. But it's noteworthy to mention here just a little bit about the impact of the autonomic nervous system on the adrenal glands. All right, first of all, you should notice that the adrenal glands sit directly on top of the kidneys. We have the right adrenal gland and the left adrenal gland, one gland sitting on top of each of the kidneys. And their job is to basically release hormones into the bloodstream. And this is key. They release these hormones directly into the bloodstream. All right? So therefore, they are going to be body-wide effectors. They are not paracrine hormones. Paracrine, remember, are hormones that are going to act locally on the tissue. Testosterone has paracrine effects within the male body. All right? So they're going to act locally, not systemically. The adrenals are going to be more concerned with systemic hormone regulation, and they tend to be a lot longer lasting, which should start to be making sense to you as we go through this. So what happens here is the preganglion enters into the cortex of the adrenal gland. From there, the autonomic ganglion will send the message down into the postganglionic neuron. Now, keep in mind, there are no dendrites. Right? There's no nothing with this postganglion neuron. It doesn't even really have an axon. It's got the cell body, and that's it. And that cell body will then go ahead and basically release the signal to secrete the appropriate hormones into the bloodstream. Now, what are the appropriate hormones associated with the adrenal glands? Well, that would be epinephrine, norepinephrine, and to a lesser degree, dopamine. Okay, so they're the guys that are going to be released by that adrenal gland. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. You will get sick and tired of hearing about epinephrine and norepinephrine by the end of this semester, because they are major players in a lot of different systems. But their root, if you would, goes back to, or their basis goes back to, the autonomic nervous system, and specifically the sympathetic nervous system. Now, I want to make sure that we have a little bit more clarity on these neurotransmitters that are present within both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. All right, remember, norepinephrine and epinephrine are primarily sympathetic neurons, and I have that right here. Okay, so these guys here are primarily sympathetic neurons. Parasympathetically speaking, we have acetylcholine. And so acetylcholine is the primary parasympathetic neurotransmitter. I'm going to issue a little caveat here, a little warning. Acetylcholine, depending on where it is released, can also impact the sympathetic nervous system. The example of that is located right here. Right, that first little line right there, bam. Right, that is the key. When acetylcholine is released from the preganglion neuron, it can act as both a sympathetic and a parasympathetic neurotransmitter. So in the case of a sympathetic neurotransmitter, the acetylcholine would travel down the preganglion neuron, go to the autonomic ganglion, and from there trigger a response where epinephrine and norepinephrine are released from the postganglion. So that's a key distinction. When acetylcholine is associated with the preganglion neuron and being released by the preganglion neuron, it can either be part of the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system. When acetylcholine is being released by specifically, strictly, and only the postganglion, it is always a parasympathetic neurotransmitter. So it's meaning it's going to have its impact or its effect within the parasympathetic nervous system. Right, so there's some major distinctions there that I want to make sure is clear. I don't know if it was exactly as clear as it could be within lecture. Now, a couple things here that I do want to point out, and I'm going to start with acetylcholine. If you remember in lecture, sorry about that. In lecture, I specifically mentioned that there were two types of receptors that acetylcholine will bind to. The first of those are the muscarinic receptors. All right. And the deal with these receptors is they tend to impact cardiac smooth muscles as well as glands. All right. Now, with that, within the cardiac, the smooth muscle, and the glands, I do want to just stress this fact, and that is that they can excite the intestinal muscle. Now, again, that's a smooth muscle, or they can inhibit or downregulate cardiac muscle. Right? So they do have two opposite effects there. Right? They can excite intestinal muscle or they can inhibit cardiac muscle. It depends on where they are released. And that's a key thing. The other thing that I will also mention here is the other type of acetylcholine receptor, which is the nicotinic receptor. Why isn't this typing? Nicotinic receptor. All right, and again, these guys here are going to be always a excitatory response within the system, and we talked a lot about this. Typically, the nicotinic receptors, these are going to be associated with your preganglion neurons. Right? So going back to that first bullet where it says it's an autonomic preganglion, nicotinic receptors will have control or response systems associated with either the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system because it's going to be released through the preganglion neuron. And so that's always going to lead to an excitatory response, whatever it is. If it's dealing with a parasympathetic nervous response system, it is going to be exciting smooth muscle or intestinal muscle in some way. If it's part of a, or skeletal muscle, could be an option if it's dealing specifically with a somatic system. Likewise, it can also stimulate the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine, which then, instead of inhibiting cardiac muscle as a nicotinic receptor, it would stimulate cardiac muscle, or possibly also stimulate skeletal muscle through that as well. So there's a lot of overlap with this, and I want to make sure that you have that down as well as you can. The other thing I will throw out there for you is along the lines of norepinephrine, all right, which also has two types. You have the alpha receptors, and you also have beta receptors that are associated with everything. Alpha receptors, it's going to promote contraction, it's going to constrict blood vessels, and it's going to inhibit intestinal motility, whereas the beta receptors are going to relax and dilate the bronchioles and excite cardiac muscle. So they work in tandem with one another to cover all of the autonomic nervous system. And real quick, what does this all look like? Well, you can see right here, this here is the somatic pathway that we talked about in AMP1. And then you have each of your other three pathways, your parasympathetic, your sympathetic, and your adrenal pathways. All right. And you can kind of take some time and study that and look at that, and that all should make sense to you. If you need to pause this and look at that, you can look at that. And remember, this is also online as the PowerPoint, regular PowerPoint, so you can print that out as well. And then we ended the class with your little research question, which is due 1 week from when I assigned it. So there are many diseases that are linked to synaptic transmissions that are faulty. They don't fire completely. And so what I would like you to do is to research and select one of these diseases. There's many, many of them. But describe how that synapse is faulted. In other words, describe how the preganglion and the autonomic ganglion, the preganglion neuron and the autonomic ganglion don't communicate well with one another, or how the autonomic ganglion and the postganglion neuron don't communicate well, or maybe it's a matter of the postganglion and the target tissue not communicating well. In some way, one of the synapses is faulted. How is it faulted? Which neurotransmitter is evolved? And what neuron type is responsible? When I say neuron type, is it a preganglion neuron? Is it a postganglion neuron? Is it an autonomic ganglion? Is it a sympathetic or parasympathetic or adrenal pathway? And then again, that's one page, single space, 12-point font, Times New Roman. Include your citations, either APA or CBE. There's more on that on the Ocean Cruiser that you can download for examples of that. 3 references, 2 of which must be a research article. One can be from a website, but not Wikipedia. Textbooks are fine to use, anything like that. And this is not meant for you to have to go to the library. You can access the databases of the library from right here on Ocean Cruiser. Just follow the links and you can do some searches on that. Try to keep your references within 5 years. And again, feel free to go back, look over this, review any of it, jot any questions down, shoot me an email, ask me in class. I'm happy to work with you to make sure that you all understand this perfectly. Until then, this is Professor Young signing off. Happy studying, and we'll see you in lecture.